For starters, what data do we have available? It's somewhat limited at times, and you'll notice that as I talk about each species. We have gill netting data, which is primarily up in that northeastern corner of the lake. The yellow shaded area is gill netting assessment done in the Bay of Quinte. The blue shaded area is gill netting done in Ontario's Eastern Outlet Basin. In that red shaded area are New York waters of the Eastern Basin. Now, the methods between the New York and Ontario assessments are a bit different. They have fixed sites that they go to 2 or more times a year, whereas on our side, we sample during the first 2 weeks of August. Our nets are randomly placed based on a stratified design. Ontario also has one extra smaller gill or mesh size in their gill nets. As far as fishery data is concerned, we have annual information from our Lake Ontario Fishing Boat Survey that covers the portion of the lake from the Niagara River up to the Eastern Basin. We interview anglers fishing in Lake Ontario itself, not the embayments. There is some Bay of Quinte recreational fishery data, very limited Eastern Basin outlet data for Ontario and New York. There's also commercial fisheries data. Most of the data is on the Ontario side. We have a very limited commercial fishery in New York waters. In Ontario, much of that netting is done in east and west bays, which I can't point to, but in Bay of Quinte as well as the St. Lawrence River. And I'll also be talking about some trap netting data today. When Jim gets talking about walleye, he'll mention bottom trawling assessment, some other sources of data that they have on the Ontario side. So first, for smallmouth bass, I'll be showing you a 3-year running average. The dots you see on the map are where Ontario's netting locations are. For the New York waters, again, our nets are randomly placed. This just gives you an example of the level of coverage we have in New York waters. The brown line is showing you the catch rate in Bay of Quinte. Relatively small population there. When strong year classes come through, we'll see a blip. But if you focus on the blue line, which is Ontario's Eastern Outlet Basin, and the red line, which is New York's Eastern Basin data, for several years now, we've been at this lower, relatively stable level of catches of smallmouth bass. We attribute this reduced level of CUEs to ecosystem changes. We know we've had lower lake productivity. Tracinids came into the system, increased water clarity. In New York waters during the 90s, we had an increasing population of cormorants, which negatively affected the population. And for several years now, that has been reduced to the management targets for the cormorant population. And more recently, round gobies entering the system and cladophora. But we anticipate that the population will remain at this lower level. Recall, we have had some warm summers, not the last 2 years, of course, but prior to that, roughly 2011, 2012, 2013 were pretty warm summers, and typically when you have a higher mean average summer temperature, you tend to have better bass recruitment. We expected to see good to strong year classes. However, in the New York waters, anyway, we are seeing no signs of good recruitment during those warm summers. But again, for the last few years, we have been at this lower, relatively stable level in the Eastern Outlet Basin. As far as fishery data, I mentioned earlier, we have annual data from the Fishing Boat Survey. That's that orange line you see on the graph. Very limited data. Aside from that, we have the yellow squares are showing you the fishery data from the Ontario's Eastern Basin, 2 green triangle or diamonds for the New York waters of the Eastern Basin, and the white triangles are showing you the results of an angler diary survey that were done on Lake Ontario's South Shore, anglers targeting smallmouth bass in the lake itself. Those values fell right on top of our Fishing Boat Survey data. The fishery on New York's South Shore in the main basin peaked in the early 2000s. It declined through the 2000s. This coincides with when round gobies increased their distribution, abundance, and biomass in the system. And we do suspect there was some interference with gobies and smallmouth bass in terms of fishing quality. But we have improved the last 5 years. We've been at a relatively stable catch rates, about 0.5 to 0.6. To our anglers, this is not a good quality fishery because they have the early 2000s catch rates that they're comparing it to. But when you think about New York's largest inland lake, Oneida Lake, these catch rates are very similar to what they've been seeing for several years now, and that's considered a good bass fishery. Now, largemouth bass, we cannot effectively sample them in our gill netting assessments. So data is quite limited. Ontario does have a trap netting survey, first initiated in 2001, and then in 2006, Hamilton Harbor and Toronto were added to that. And this just kind of gives you a spatial perspective of the warmwater fish community in Ontario and embayments, and it's essentially saying, yes, there's largemouth bass present in all the embayments they surveyed. This is the case in New York waters as well. We don't have any assessments that would prove that, but we do have reports of anglers catching them. And the higher catches occurring in the upper and lower portions of the Bay of Quinte. Fortunately, in that area, we do have recreational fishery data. It's not collected every year, but it was collected in 2015. About, there are roughly 4,000 anglers interviewed, about 16% of them were specifically targeting bass, and this equates to about 33,000 angler hours of fishing effort. Estimated catch was about 17,500, and the catch per angler hour in 2015 is similar to what we've been seeing since about 1999, which is a higher level than what occurred through the 1990s. So we do think some of the ecosystem changes that have happened, improvements in water quality, vegetation growth in the nearshore areas, have perhaps improved the quality of habitat for largemouth bass. For yellow perch, again, those same gill netting locations and looking at a 3-year moving average. In the Bay of Quinte and Ontario waters of the Eastern Outlet Basin, they've been seeing a declining population for a few years now. In New York's Eastern Basin waters, we weren't seeing that up until a couple of years ago. In fact, we saw improved catches in roughly 2008 through 2013. We saw the similar trend in our fishing boat survey, catches among anglers, where we had lower estimated catch through the 90s into the early 2000s that improved. And really just the last 3 years, we saw reduced catches back down to the levels we saw in the 1990s. So it does appear the perch population has declined recently, and the cause of that is unclear. As far as commercial fishery data, again, most of the bulk of Lake Ontario's commercial fishery is occurring in Ontario waters in the northeast corner and in the St. Lawrence River. About 10% of the harvest in 2015 was yellow perch. And if you look at the harvest for New York, 2015 was actually the first year where New York harvest of yellow perch was higher than Ontario. But I do want to point out that the New York fishery is relatively small. We only have 3 active licenses. There's very little effort, and it's been hovering at this low level, whereas the Ontario yellow perch commercial fishery, similar to their gill net data, has been in decline for a few years. And finally, northern pike. Again, these are just like largemouth bass. We don't effectively sample them in our gill netting assessment. We don't have any assessments that would give us an index or abundance on this species over a period of years, but we do have trap netting data on the Ontario side, which again indicates, yes, northern pike are located in the embayments. Most of the populations appear low. There are some moderate-sized populations. We have the same situation on our side, we suspect. We don't have much data to support that, but we do have relatively low catches of northern pikes being reported by anglers. Where we do have long-term data on northern pike, which Mike Yule already showed you this data, this is the New York, Thousand Island, St. Lawrence River region gillnet data, where it shows that lower population level in recent years relative to the earlier years. We suspect this has also happened in Lake Ontario, and as Mike indicated, attribute it to habitat changes. So in summary, smallmouth bass population is at a relatively stable but lower level. Largemouth bass appear stable at a higher level than what we once saw. Yellow perch has been in decline more recently on the New York side, but for a few years now in Ontario. Not clear on the cause of that. And finally, northern pike, again, they're closely linked to wetlands for spawning habitat, and we do suspect populations lower in Lake Ontario based on quality and quantity of spawning habitat, and there are some moderate populations out there.